You're trying not to cry. Not because something terrible happened. Someone just said something small. Maybe they thanked you unexpectedly. Maybe you saw an old couple holding hands. Maybe a stranger looked exhausted on the train. Maybe someone raised their voice, and even though they weren't yelling at you, you felt your chest tighten. And suddenly, your eyes are filling up. You look away, you swallow, you tell yourself, seriously? Why am I crying over this? Because sometimes the hardest part about crying easily isn't the crying, it's the embarrassment afterward. You wonder if people think you're dramatic, too sensitive, emotionally unstable, weak. So you learn to hide it. You blink quickly, you laugh it off, you leave the room. You apologize for having a reaction that your body seemed to have before your mind could stop it. But what if the problem isn't that you feel too much? What if you've simply learned to judge yourself for feeling deeply? There's an important distinction here. Crying easily does not automatically mean someone is an empath. And being highly empathetic doesn't mean you absorb every emotion around you like a sponge. But people who are highly emotionally sensitive can experience other people's emotions with unusual intensity. And that sensitivity can be surprisingly complicated. Because empathy isn't just one thing. Psychologists often distinguish between different forms of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what another person might be feeling. There's emotional empathy, actually experiencing an emotional response when you witness someone else's emotion. And there's compassionate empathy, where understanding someone's experience creates a desire to help. A person who cries easily may have a strong emotional response to situations that other people process more intellectually. They don't necessarily think that person is sad. They may feel something closer to, I can almost feel what this must be like. And that difference matters. Imagine you're watching someone receive devastating news in a movie. One person watches quietly, another immediately starts crying. The second person isn't necessarily more emotionally mature. They may simply have a stronger emotional resonance with what they're seeing. And this is where the stereotype of the overly sensitive person starts to fall apart, because sensitivity isn't the same thing as fragility. Think about your nervous system. Your brain is constantly deciding what deserves attention. Facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, silences, tiny changes in someone's behavior. For some people, these signals barely register. For others, they stand out immediately. You notice that your friend says they're fine, but their voice is slightly different. You notice when someone in the room becomes uncomfortable. You can tell when a joke went too far. You sense tension before anyone says there's a problem. And sometimes that awareness can be exhausting because noticing more means there is more to process. You might walk into a room and instantly notice who seems uncomfortable. You might replay a conversation because you detected a tiny shift in someone's tone. You might spend hours wondering whether someone is upset with you even after they insist they're fine. And occasionally, your sensitivity can become tangled with anxiety. That's an important nuance. Not every intense emotional reaction is empathy. Sometimes crying easily can be influenced by stress, exhaustion, hormonal changes, unresolved grief, anxiety, trauma, or simply being overwhelmed. Human emotions are rarely caused by one personality trait. So this isn't about romanticizing every emotional reaction. It's about understanding what might be happening instead of immediately labeling yourself as weak. Because crying itself is not a reliable measurement of emotional strength. In fact, tears can serve several psychological and physiological functions. They can accompany emotional arousal and help communicate distress, vulnerability, or connection. Think about how quickly human beings respond to another person's tears. You don't need a speech. You don't need an explanation. A crying face communicates something instantly. Something matters here. And perhaps that's part of why emotionally sensitive people sometimes feel exposed when they cry. The tears reveal something before they're ready to explain it. That's uncomfortable, especially in environments where emotional control is treated as competence. You've probably seen this contradiction. Someone can be completely overwhelmed internally and still be praised for keeping it together. Meanwhile, someone who visibly reacts gets called emotional. But visible emotion and emotional instability are not the same thing. Someone can cry and still make thoughtful decisions. Someone can feel deeply and still have boundaries. Someone can be sensitive and still be incredibly resilient. And resilience doesn't mean becoming unaffected. It means being able to experience something difficult without letting it completely define your behavior. This is especially important for people who grew up believing their emotions were inconvenient. Maybe you were told to stop crying. Maybe people laughed when you got emotional. Maybe you learned that showing sadness made you vulnerable. Maybe you became the person who apologized every time you had feelings. Over time, you may develop an unusual relationship with your own emotions. You experience them intensely, but immediately try to suppress them. And suppression doesn't necessarily make the emotion disappear. Sometimes it just adds another layer. First comes sadness, then embarrassment about being sad, then frustration that you're embarrassed. Then the thought, why can't I just be normal? Now you're not dealing with one emotion, you're dealing with an entire stack of them. This is one reason emotionally sensitive people can become extremely self-critical. They don't just feel emotions, they monitor themselves feeling them. Am I crying too much? Did they notice? Was that reaction embarrassing? Why am I still thinking about this? And ironically, that self-monitoring can make emotional experiences feel even more intense. There is another subtle side to this. People who are highly attuned to others can sometimes become very good at understanding everyone else except themselves. You know when your friend needs space, you know when someone wants reassurance, you know how to soften your words so you don't hurt someone. But when you're the one who's overwhelmed, suddenly you don't know what you need. You tell yourself you're fine, you keep helping, you keep listening, you keep absorbing the emotional atmosphere around you, until eventually something tiny becomes the thing that makes you cry. And someone might say, "Why are you crying about that?" But they're seeing the final drop. They aren't seeing everything that came before it. The conversation you kept thinking about, the person you worried about, the stress you never talked about, the exhaustion, the disappointment, the things you kept swallowing because there always seemed to be something more important. Sometimes the tears aren't really about the last thing that happened. They're about everything you didn't have space to feel earlier. That doesn't mean every crying episode has some hidden psychological meaning. Sometimes you're simply tired. Sometimes you're overwhelmed. Sometimes a sad song catches you at exactly the wrong or right moment. Human beings aren't machines with perfectly separated emotional compartments. We're constantly carrying experiences forward. And for highly sensitive people, those experiences may remain especially vivid. That can be painful, but it can also create strengths. You may remember how people made you feel. You may be unusually thoughtful about your words. You may notice suffering other people overlook. You may become the friend who checks in when everyone else assumes someone is okay. You may understand that an "I'm fine" doesn't always mean fine. And perhaps most importantly, you may know what it feels like to be emotionally unseen. That can make you exceptionally careful about making other people feel seen. But there is a boundary worth remembering. Empathy without boundaries can become emotional exhaustion. You are allowed to care without carrying everything. You are allowed to understand someone's pain without making it your responsibility. You are allowed to leave a conversation without fixing the other person's emotions. And you are allowed to protect your own nervous system. Because empathy isn't supposed to mean disappearing into everyone else's experience. Healthy empathy includes yourself. It asks not only, what are they feeling, but also, what am I feeling right now? What belongs to me? What belongs to them? And perhaps that is the deeper lesson behind people who cry easily. The goal isn't to become someone who never cries. The goal isn't to prove that you're tough by becoming emotionally numb. It's to stop treating your emotions as evidence against you. Maybe you still cry during movies. Maybe you tear up when someone is genuinely kind to you. Maybe you get emotional when you see someone being treated unfairly. Maybe you need a little more time to recover after difficult conversations. None of those things automatically make you weak. They simply tell you that something reached you. And sometimes the world teaches sensitive people to build walls around that part of themselves. But sensitivity can be both a vulnerability and a capacity. It can hurt more, and it can allow you to notice more. The important part is learning the difference between feeling deeply and being controlled by what you feel. So the next time you find yourself trying desperately not to cry over something that seems too small, pause before judging yourself. Maybe it isn't weakness. Maybe your mind and body are simply saying, "This mattered to me." And that's not necessarily something you need to apologize for.